legal status of Liberland and how to settle Liberland and how this can be done in compliance with the standing law, which is kind of a good question. How can we actually presume that we can start a country since nobody really does that these times? Well, I'll show you how soon. So, first, some history. This can be familiar for most of you, but we'll go through it. So, there was the Yugoslav Wars. That was a horrible, bloody conflict in Europe, the bloodiest after the Second World War, and that ended with a peace process called Dayton Peace Process, catalyzed through the Western sphere, let's say, and Richard Holbrooke was one of the main architects. So the peace process was like a peace conference, and that peace conference, that was diplomats and head of state and so on, were working on that. Well, diplomats mostly. So such a peace conference needs to have a organ which works as expert advisory body, so to say. So they are not all expected to be experts in international law matters, right? And so they had this Badinter Commission. That was what it was called, Badinter Commission, which was established actually with the help of the European communities back then. And it was named after the head of the commission, who was surnamed Badinter. It was mostly composed of former state high officials, like ministers and such, but they were experts in international law, or seen as that. They had a power to advise. So their advices were not binding in any way, but they were respected. And they were mostly respected as if it was like the law. Amongst the many questions they were dealing with was the question of how to delimitate the borders. And there were borders now between many countries, because it used to be all one Yugoslavia, as you're doubtlessly aware, but it broke up into Bosnia, Serbia, Croatia, and Serbia, that's the most important for us. They decided, which is an unusual way how to decide such a question in international law. It is more usual in normal internal law, like when you have two neighbors who are arguing. So they used kind of the system based on private law, for better or for worse. And it would be for worse for the legal certainty of that land. It would be for the better for us, for Liberland. So they decided that they would use the principle uti possidentis iuris, which means, and I will paraphrase, the peaceful possession prevails. So there is an assumption of a peaceful possession, meaning that those who held the land before the decision will be able to keep the land unless there are more facts found, which in the private law usually there are, because they are findable, because it's about real estate usually, and those facts in most European countries at least would be written somewhere in a cadastral register. So that would be a matter of like going through a legal dispute or something like that, and then the dispute gets resolved. And here we have new facts. So the uti possidentis iuris is really a temporary thing, and it is meant as such. It's a Roman law institute, that's why the name, and it's just meant to settle the matters until a later decision is made, which would be a final decision. And again, it's usually a court, but here we are in the international arena. So they said, very simple, we will resolve this right now, temporarily, until you guys can make a decision together. And that would be those who possess the land previously will continue possessing it until it gets resolved with a final resolution. And they imagine some kind of a bilateral diplomatic solution, maybe the International Court of Justice, but probably more the first thing. Now, how was it divided? Well, it was divided by uti possidentis iuris. So those who possessed it before possessed it after the decision. However, that created a question, because not all the parties understood their possession in the same way, meaning that Serbia believed that it possessed all the lands on the left bank of the Danube, and we're looking at the Danube from the source, right? We're not looking from the sea. And Croatia did not believe the mirror of that statement. So that would be that it would possess the right bank, and that would be resolved. There is no Liberland. Well, it's not so simple, luckily for us, and probably unluckily for the region. At least for now, at least until we can establish Liberland and make this problem into a great solution for the entire region, which is one of the points of our enterprise here. So the Croatians believed that their peaceful possession was whatever was on the cadastral maps before the 1940s. Now, those cadastral maps were also based on the Danube, but they were based on a flow of the Danube which was no longer actual. Because the Danube moves, it's a living river, it moves. The bottom is mud, and floods move the main stream, right? So there were two interpretations of what constitutes a peaceful possession, and there were several ways how this went wrong, and actually two major or wrong right for us. One of those ways would be what happened to an island called Vukovarska Ada, which is that's an example. It was not the only one. That's a big island close to a city of Vukovar, which is Croatian. And then both sides say that it's theirs. Croatians would say that it always belonged to Vukovar. And Serbians would say, look, it's on our side, so it's ours. So that's way number one. And way number two, how this got interesting, let's say, so unclear, uncertain, is that both parties decided that they don't own a certain piece of land, and therefore that piece of land remained in uncertainty. And this was expected, kind of, because they expected there would be a bilateral diplomatic process that would resolve the issue, which never happened. So the uncertainty remained. And now, what I'm calling Nash equilibrium, that's from game theory, that's a situation which is beneficial for a player of a game. And now, games we can understand as any situation, so even diplomatic dispute would be a game, even though it's very serious. So, if Croatia would have its way, then Serbia would lose a lot because Croatian cadastral maps, the way how Danube was before 1940s, happened to be very fortuitous for Croatia. So it would get more land than simply if it were now the current Danube stream. Yeah. So if Serbia would have its way, Croatia would lose less than if Croatia would have its way, what Serbia would lose. So if everything went according to Croatia, then rather big swaths of land on the other side of the river, on the side against Liberland, on the Serbian side, would become Croatia. Now, Serbian politicians want to hear nothing of that because they want to keep its territory contiguous, which means attached to each other, like reasonable, sensible, which is kind of understandable. And they would say that indeed, if their way was the way, it is kind of a compromise because Croatia would not lose as much as Serbia would lose if matters went Croatia way. The bottom line for that is that this dragged on the dispute into the 2010s, like 2010 plus. And so there was no possibility of a Croat-originated solution, and there was a little possibility of Croatia accepting Serbia-originated solution because those countries, for most of those times, weren't the best of friends, amongst other reasons. And Croatia just didn't want to give up its claims. Gornja Siga, which we now know as Liberland, because it is Liberland, it's the country which we are now working to establish, was one of those second types of land which got abandoned by both parties, both Serbia and Croatia. Yes, so it became what is called terra nullius. Terra nullius means a land of nobody or no man's land. That's a principle which is ancient in international law, and although criticized for, let's say, connections to colonial past and so on, the authorities on that law and all the books I have seen after this criticism is given have to concede that this principle still operates. Because there is not much else to do with lands that belong to no one. And that could be parts of Antarctica, not all, but parts. There is a rather big swath of land in Africa which is like that, and there are other lands. And Liberland, due to that development which we just described, became one of those terra nulliuses, and it became so during the decades which passed after the Badinter Commission has said uti possidentis iuris. Okay, we don't know when it became terra nullius, but we can, taking from what countries do if a piece of land is abandoned, we can assume that it was somewhere after 10 years of uncertainty. And this is a correct way how to work in international law, because international law works with the status of the International Court of Justice, which is the world court, let's say. It was meant as that in any case. And that status, that legal document, founding document, lists this as a good procedure, so that international legal problems will be resolved, if you have no better way to do it, with general principles of law as practiced, and the status says a weird thing, by civilized countries. Usually modern lawyers, international lawyers, say just by majority of countries or something like that. But it used to, like the written law is civilized countries. And therefore, the bottom line of this is that Liberland became claimable, or Gornia Siga it was back then. It became claimable. Somebody could claim it. Who can claim something like this and make a state out of it? Now, the international law would hint at the possible interpretation, which I think is correct, that a state can claim such a land. Well, that's why we made one, or our president and other enthusiasts made a state, founded a state, and then claimed the Gornia Siga land for that state. Okay, so we fulfilled materially and formally the requirements of the law by this founding in 2015, birthday of Thomas Jefferson. Now, that means that, and all the other things which we talked about, means that Liberland's status, what we're talking now about today, status of Liberland, legal status, Liberland is not Croatia. First and foremost, it's the most important part. Liberland is not Croatia. Croatians themselves are quite adamant in theory and in practice to renounce and keep on renouncing that territory. Now, why would that be? Because in international law, practice is very important. And if Croatians would treat Liberland as if it was Croatia, then they would, in effect, say they would accept the Serbian interpretation, because the only reason why Liberland could be Croatia is that right side is Croatia, left side is Serbia, which is precisely what Croatians don't want. So they want Liberland to actually be Serbia, or to be whatever, but definitely not Croatia. And even as recently as this spring, when we asked about a Croatian policeman, even the Croatian policeman, even the lowest of the low, would tell you, like in the hierarchy of the government, would tell you that there is a border there, it's being enforced. Well, we'll talk about that this is not good, that it's enforced, it's not legal either, but it is being enforced, and it is a border of the cadastral parcels. And now every country ends where the last cadastral parcel of that country ends. So this is a good answer that says that there is a border. Also, there is a standing jurisprudence never overturned. Jedlička and Sambunjak, I think you are familiar with the name Jedlička. It is President Jedlička, obviously, which quite controversially stated that there is a border there. Now, the question was, where is the border? And that's a good question, and we'll talk about that. But the court said, we don't know, but we're sure that it is definitely beyond the place where Mr. Jedlička and Mr. Sambunjak went in that case, and so they had to pay a fine. However, this also established the border, the land border, as an entity in Croatian law. So Croatia now, in its jurisprudence, in its practice, and in its theory, in its diplomatic statement and everything, it considers Liberland to be not Croatia. Therefore, Liberland is a sovereign state, because if Liberland is not Croatia, and it's definitely not Serbia, because Serbia doesn't go beyond the Danube, then the terra nullius claim is correct. Now, what could stop that? States have their own definition, and that's in the Montevideo Convention, which was established to resolve issues where there were questions of, is it a state, is it not a state? This was the time before the real decolonization, when colonies became mandate territories of the Community of Nations, and then in the UN phase of international law, when decolonization came to be. So the question was about, like, are those people civilized enough? So that was kind of the context of this convention's setup, and it was created based on jurisprudence and on legal opinions of many experts. So it establishes 4 criteria. You have to have a territory. It has to have a government, and you're talking to a part of it. We have a president, we have 4 ministers, we have a government. it has to be able to deal internationally. And we do that. There is a diplomacy of Liberland, as you well know, or if you don't know, you can learn about it on liberland.org. We have 85 representative offices. We have memoranda of understanding with UN members like Haiti, and we have other diplomatic efforts. So we are able to deal internationally, and we respect our obligations. That's a second kind of a subpart of that. Effective control. Well, have people right now in Liberland. So they are the only people there, as far as I understand. So they could be understood to have effective control at this point. Now, are they going to stay there forever? We don't know. But the effective control requirement has a special mitigating condition, which the jurisprudence agrees on, and it is voiced in the Chicago Journal article about us, for example, and that says that okay, effective control is a rule of what is a state. However, if there is a party, like a different state, like Croatia in our case, which effectively blocks that control from taking place, then that party cannot say, oh, it's not a country, there is no effective control, so we can do whatever we want with that territory. No, that would be, of course, remember what I talked about, the decolonization efforts, self-determination of nations and all that thing. That would, of course, be a tool of colonizers to oppress the people who are native to the land, because you can say, well, we just put in prison all their elites, and then they can't control the country. They're obviously primitive, so we can continue ruling the territory. No problem. Well, that's not how the Montevideo Convention was built. That's not the goal. That actually goes against the goals, against the goal of the international law, against the principles of the UN Charter, and against basically every internationally binding and valid law which you can think of. So this is a strong argument, and we follow this at Liberland, and we think it's correct, even if you would be very unbiased, like with Liberland, that Croatians cannot claim that we don't have effective control and therefore we're not a state. Others could claim that. However, they have to take a look at it, that it is being enforced by Croatia. Now that we know that we have a state, or I hope I convinced you that we do have a state, we have to ask ourselves whether settling Liberland is legal, because we don't want to do anything illegal internationally or even like intra-nationally. We're not separatists. We are claiming a part of a land which nobody cared about in part of both countries, which is not exactly the golden center of those countries. It's a periphery. It's an agrarian periphery. And we want to create a big city. We want to benefit the entire region. Now, the only way to effectively do that is to do it legally, properly, morally, and everything. And this is what we're all about. Settling Liberland, in my opinion, is indeed legal. And it's legal according to international law, which we talked about before. And it is legal according to also internal law of those countries. Why? Because those countries don't have jurisdiction over Liberland. And therefore, those countries cannot claim that Liberland is theirs, and they shouldn't be able to enforce their law in Liberland. We can see that, for example, and by the way, I'm talking shouldn't, but I should be saying they don't. Because they really don't. They don't treat it, even in practice, as if it was Croatia. Well, this is mostly Croatia. We're talking mostly with Croatians, dealing with Croatians, but Serbia, obviously, also. Both countries, I will illustrate this on a very good example. Both countries are very adamant on you not being able to camp in wilderness. So unless you're a fisherman or hunter, you can't put your tent just somewhere where you want in the forest. If you do, you risk quite a high fine. In Croatia, they are very, very stringent with that. You can't even rest in a car. If you're going down to the coast, then if you stop a car at the roadside, you may be fined by the police, and they are very, very happy to do that. However, in all the history of Liberland settlement, not once have we been accused of being illegal campers, although had we done exactly the same thing as we have done in Liberland, we would have been, if we have done exactly the same thing as we have done in Liberland, a kilometer to the left, therefore in Croatia, therefore somewhere next to Zmajevac or Batina, which are the towns in Croatia, then we would immediately be fined for illegal camping, and we'd be asked to pack up our stuff and go. So here you can see that settling Liberland is not prohibited according to Croatian or Serbian law because those legal systems are not being applied in Liberland, at least not consistently. And that's where we're going now. So we established that in principle it may be legal to settle Liberland. We were talking about some doubts about consistently. We will get to that. But if you want to settle Liberland, you better get there. And you can get there by land and you can get there by water. So can you get there? In principle, I mean, can you get there agnostic to the method? If it was illegal to get there, then it doesn't matter if you're trying to break the law on the land or break the law on the river. However, I'm arguing that it is legal to get there, and let's see how. You should try to enter Liberland from Schengen, which is the European area of free movement. That's easier, legally easier. So I'm treating it here as the method of going there. So that means not going from the other side of the Danube. Means going from Croatia or going on a ship from Croatia or from Hungary or something like that. If you go through the Croatia-Liberland border in any way, shape or form, we're now not talking about the specifics, you in effect leave Croatia and you would leave Schengen. However, you do not enter any country besides Liberland because there is no other country, because no country claims it. Now, this is kind of technical, but Liberland, as you well know, is not recognized by Croatia or by Serbia. So for their legal system, Liberland is a non-entity. For their legal system, it's still just a Gornja Siga, just a terra nullius. And that means that you're not entering a border. You're just leaving a border. Now, who leaves a border without entering another border? That happens every day. Where? On the open sea. Now, open sea has its own legal regime, which is special, and this is to do with something called the freedom of the seas. However, that's not important here. That's not a distinction, I would say, because open sea is a no man's land, and it cannot be claimed effectively. So that's a distinction, but it is a no man's land. So in that sense, it is like Gornja Siga. So when you go to Gornja Siga, according to Croatian law, you're actually doing the same thing as a ship captain going to the sea. And a ship captain who leaves the territorial waters doesn't need to go to a passport place to register themselves. Oh no, they go and they go back, they come back. So in the same way, you are exercising your free movement rights, which Croatian constitution does allow you. Croatian constitution shouldn't apply in Liberland, but it applies on you leaving Croatia. In that sense, you never truly leave Schengen. That is, you never truly leave Schengen for a non-Schengen country. We know that you do, in fact, because Liberland isn't and will never be in Schengen, but they don't know it, or they don't care about it. And it is actually good for us that they don't, at this point, from that point of view. Now, with the land border, there is one more thing, and we talked about it already. By the way, this is an attempt to, the picture is an attempt to render Croatian police as the Keystone Cops. It didn't really work. But that's why they have the mustaches and they are quite fat. This is not how they look in the real life. There are certain rules about how a border should be. Remember the Jedlička versus Sambunjak case, the court case, where Vít Jedlička was sentenced to a fine because they crossed the border between Croatia and something, effectively, between Croatia and Gornja Siga. And the court said, we don't know where the border is. We will not be dealing with this question. We just know that it must be somewhere where they already crossed it. So when we found them in Gornja Siga, they were already not in Croatia, so they had to have crossed the border. Now, that's a good way how to make your life easier as a judge. But the point of a judge's job is not to make his life easier. The point of a judge's job is to dispense justice according to the legal system. And the legal system says explicitly, and it's also European principle and European law, that borders must be delimited, meaning that there has to be a very clear, very undisputable definition of where the border is, like markings of exact place in the land. And it's usually done with words, and there are cadastral measure people who are specialized into that. Geodets, it's called in Slavic lands. I don't know how it's called in yours. Geodet. And they have like this stuff, and they put it in the ground, and they measure the border, and that apparently has never happened here. Or if it has happened, it's not being put into any legal document, and that's a problem. Because if a border is not thusly delimited, and also if the border is not marked, and this one isn't, and I can tell you because I've been there and I've seen no markings, nobody ever has, so we don't know exactly where the border is if you come there, and you have to be able to see that. Well, if the border is neither delimited nor clearly marked, then it can't be enforced. But it is enforced. So that enforcement is illegal. And that would not be a problem in a non-rule of law country, but Croatia in the Article 3 of its constitution says that it is a rule of law country, which means that laws have to be clear, explicit, and no enforcement can take place except based on such a law. So they are not doing it correctly, and therefore I have taken the liberty of putting the Keystone Cops there, stopping the people from going over an uncertain border is a limitation of the Croatian freedom of movement clause. And such a freedom of movement clause can only be limited based on a sufficiently specific and reasoned out legal provision, which we don't have. We do have the geodesic maps. I've seen them, and indeed, there is like a white point on them. So I wouldn't say it's sufficiently clear because foreign countries look differently than Liberland. It's how the Croatian policeman said it. It's a border of a cadastral territory on the geodesic map. But there is a white area which kind of looks like Croatia, but it isn't. And everybody tells you this is not Croatia. There are no cadastral parcels in there or anything. But it's also not like listed as an actual foreign country. So I would humbly suggest that we can even say that it's not clearly delimited, even if we would say that this would suffice, like the cadastral map. So that's for Tom, just niceties and theory, but I think this is sustainable to say. Okay, now we're getting to the river border. So the river border would be the same case, normally speaking. But it isn't in practice because the river needs to be navigated. And the river is an internationally managed river, as I like to say. Some say international river. That means that not all of the river is managed by one country, which couldn't be possible because it flows through many. And so there is a treaty, two treaties on the Danube, which say which countries will manage the traffic and everything on the river, and they are harmonized so that you don't have like rule set A on this part of the river and rule set B on Croatian part of the river and so on. So the rules say that if you, as a country, own the border, you're managing the river there, yeah? Well, that would mean that people floating the Danube for business, for tourism, and so on, would have to here cross the border, meaning stop, meet the police, show the papers, and go on, about 4 times. Because there are places which are then like both Serbia, both sides of the river. Then you have another part which is both Croatia, both Serbia, both Croatia, and you have several of those. So what they did, very reasonable, is that the border polices made agreements or sort of a customs, so that the left side is simply Serbia and the right side is Croatia, which looks a lot like the Serbian proposal to resolve this dispute, right? But it's not a resolution. It's not a law as far as I understand. It's just something for practical purposes. It's an agreement between the police departments, could be written, I think it is, that Croatian police is responsible for the river up until that kilometer, and then after that is, I think it's somewhere near Vukovar, so deep under Liberland. Under that, it's Serbia, and that's for the right side of the river. So if you go from Hungary, and if you go from Serbia, you stay in Serbia until that crossing. Yeah. So the other side is Serbian, and the right side is Croatian, and that ignores the real border lines. So obviously there is a problem here, because again, let's remind ourselves of the Article 3, the rule of law. It's great that we now know which police will keep us safe on the river. However, such a arbitrary agreement can never, never be the cause of you getting a fine, because you get a fine by breaking a law. If that agreement is not a law, then if you act somehow where if that agreement was a law, let's say if some part of the river was Croatia and something was prohibited there, and you broke those rules, then you cannot be fined. Why? Because it is as if that's a fiction world, but from the legal point of view. But it's not a world of written law or of jurisprudence or anything like that. Yeah, I mean this is quite complicated. I think it sounds complicated to me as I say it. So basically, you have the law, which says that that the border is like a patchwork, like Croatia, Serbia, and that's the only thing you can get fined for. And if on top of that layer, like it's like Bitcoin is the first layer and Lightning is the second layer of the blockchain, right? If on top of that layer the police create some kind of other rule because it's convenient for them, they have the right to do so. However, if you only break that secondary rule and not the underlying law, you should be set free in most cases, and there are cases where this wouldn't be the case, but they have to do with things where you actually break even the underlying law, but in a complicated way. Let's not get deep into this. So, most of the time, you have to break the real law, which brings us here to the riverside. So, just to make it very clear, the Croatian police has placed signs of no parking due to us. Okay? So, after Liberland was settled, very soon after that, during the time that this Vjedička Sambunjak case was being carried through the judicial system of Croatia, those signs were placed there. Those signs say no parking. That's important. B, right? No parking. What that means is that you cannot put your ship into the water, stop it, and bind it to the side, or keep it halfway in the water, or and halfway on the land, or something like that. What it doesn't say is that you wouldn't be able to get the ship on the land. That's fine. Like if you can carry it out, you're not parking anything. You just can't have a ship stop there. The supposed reason is that there are dangerous currents and it is very low, the water, and so it's dangerous, right? However, there are two bigger problems besides this being obviously made bogus and to harm us. Why is it a problem that it's being made bogus and to harm us? Is that we have done nothing wrong. There is no reason why Croatia should prosecute Liberlanders. We are legitimate initiative, right? So they would be discriminating us in effect. Well, they are if they create signs only due to us. Of course, practically, it's not so easy to prove that at the court. Luckily for us and unluckily for Croatia, there are two other problems which are very easy to prove at the court, and we're actually trying to do that. Point number one. The law on river traffic in Croatia is not very clear, but how I read it and how our attorney reads it, it makes an either or distinction between bigger boats and smaller boats. So you have boats which are bigger than X, and X is quite big. It's like boats for like 20 meters, boats for 12 or more people, boats with more powerful engine than X, boats capable of carrying more than X, and so on. So like most Liberland boats are not that. And then you have the smaller boats, which is everything else, and then you have super small boats. Now, if you ask the officials in Croatia, they will tell you that those signs, like the P's, generally apply only to the bigger boats. If you look into the law, and if you understand it that it's either or, so your boat is either a ship or a boat, bigger ship or a smaller boat, then you are left with no other option than to say that those signs would only apply to the bigger ships. And the Capitanate of Vukovar has told me that it is indeed the case. However, in Liberland, that's not the case, and just don't land there. And there the signs apply even for smaller boats and even for canoes and kayaks, which are like that's a third level of boat, that's the smallest boats. For those it applies nowhere else, says the Capitanate, just in Liberland. And don't go there, don't land there, you'll be arrested. And that's because of political reasons. I don't think they would tell it to me now if I called, because they know better. But this is a admission of the point number one, discrimination, obviously. And it is such that they have no jurisdiction to stop us. And of course, they are trying to stop our settlers. If you know, these signs are being used in practice in order to not allow settlers to land or to get their supplies. In essence, in order to force the settlers to go hungry. which in itself is immoral and illegal. But those signs don't have just those two huge problems. There is a third problem. Remember the complex discussion about the delimitation of the border versus the agreement? Well, signs follow the border, not the agreement. Signs are enforceable only based on the law, because Article 3, rule of law country. Therefore, if a part of the coast is in fact not Croatia, the sign does not apply on it. So there are no signs there, because there is no authority to put them there, unless Croatia would want to claim Liberland or would want to do something else which they're not doing. Therefore, those signs have many legal problems. And those signs are a problem for us. Just like this practice is a problem for us, because we are being stopped at the border on the land and we're being stopped at the border on the river. We have a incentive to do something with it, and we're working on that, and that will be the last slide when I tell you how we are working on that. That's a clown, and it's a policeman, and he is going to play some tricks, because that's what happens. So police until recently has been just fining Liberlanders for crossing a border, and it was doing this very clumsily, because if they went from Serbia, it fined them from crossing Serbia-Liberland border, and if they went from Croatia, it fined them crossing the Croatia-Liberland border. So they basically created some situation which I had called back then Schrödinger's border. If you know what a Schrödinger's cat is, it's half dead, half alive because of probabilities, and it's an intuition pump. It doesn't exist in real life. It's about a thing being simultaneously A and B, and A is not B. And so this was the type of legal reasoning the Croatian police was using to issue fines, which is obviously quite absurd. And therefore, when they became part of the Schengen, and therefore their border was also in a shared manner became managed by the European Union. Not that it would be their sole responsibility or something, but it became shared responsibility. Then such practices as Schrödinger borders had to end. And because it's not Croatia or Serbia, so there would be no, hey, you're illegally camping here. So there would be actually no nothing except for the signs, which we have just had it over that they are illegal, and the crossing of the land borders. Okay, so we will come from the river. So the Croatian police had nothing on us. And so what they did, what they decided to do, and that's why we have this smiling guy, is to become tricky. And they have decided that Liberland is a wilderness, and it's a dangerous place, and we are reckless. And therefore we have gotten ourselves into a situation of danger, indeed a dire danger, and we do need to be rescued. And for some reason, we are unable to give consent to our own rescue because, well, they never tell us why. Actually, they never asked us. And how it in practice happens is that you are there, as a settler, and then they start pressuring you, they start threatening you, and then they start taking your stuff. And of course, you want to have your stuff because it's your food, a place where you can sleep, and so on. So they actually create that situation of dire need. And then you usually give up and you just get to the boat with them. They promise to take you to the doctor and then bring you back to Gornja Siga, which is probably going to happen when hell gets cold. Usually you get a one-way trip to the nearest train station, and that's where it ends for you. That's a neat trick. However, it's illegal. And it's very illegal because a rescue is an internationally understood term. Again, we recall the principles of law by civilized nations. And rescue has to have some kind of rules. You can't just say that when the police wants to evict someone, let's say from his home, because they don't like his political ideas, that it's a rescue. Well, that would not be rule of law country. Article 3 Croatian Constitution would not allow this. Furthermore, if there is no good reason, which there isn't, or if there is no consent, so, hey, I agree, I want to be rescued, I am in danger, something like that, that would be a consent, then actually that rescue attempt would be kidnapping. And kidnapping is a crime in Croatian law, just like in almost any other law. And I'm saying crime with up to 5 years in prison, if I remember correctly. Since they are taking away the supplies to motivate people, and they are, of course, doing it without their consent, indeed, against their expressed lack of consent or refusal to give consent, then that's called larceny, theft. And it is likewise punishable. And it could also be aggravated larceny, which is even more punishable because they are creating a situation which is dangerous. And aggravated larceny is when you're putting someone in danger while you're robbing them, right? So, unfortunately for the Croatian police, this trick isn't so effective and it's not legal. So, what we do, we have a border which shouldn't be enforced because it's not clearly marked, let's say, or even clearly delimited if the white patch on the cadastral map is not enough. What do we have more? We have signs on the river which shouldn't be there out for many reasons. And even if they are there, even if we accept that they should be there, they do not apply to our boats. And we have rescue attempts, which are really kidnappings or larceny or larceny. So we go to the attorneys, and we have one, Dr. Carlo Novosel. He is a Croatian attorney who is very proficient in highly politically acclaimed cases. He is often in Croatian television, and he knows not just the law, which he knows very well. I talked to him, but he knows also who thinks what in Croatia, what's important in Croatian public opinion, and so on. So he's the man for the job. He's one of the best on trust pilots and so on. There are special trust pilots for lawyers, where I looked, not just like normal customers. This is expert side. And so he's one of the best, and so we have him. And he decided, which we agreed wholeheartedly with, that we should complain as to the police twisting the rules and breaking the law, which they are. And that case is now being processed before the Croatian court system. And now, before you say, yeah, but Croatian court system is going to be biased for Croatia, in fact, no. Remember the Jedlička versus Sambunjak case? The higher the court it went to, the more just the verdict. And they were really dealing with that. And the higher court actually said that the border has to be delimited by the lower court, which was a trap, saying like, drop it. Because the court can, of course, not delimitate border and it cannot mark the border. The lower court said, no, it doesn't have to be, we don't care. And we kind of accepted it back then for reasons which were important back then. And we got the border, right? So that was important. But the courts have not been hostile to us. And even recently, there was a case with some promotion materials which the Croatian police didn't like, and they gave us a fine, and the court made that into a symbolic fine and basically agreed with our argumentation. So the courts are not our enemies. We should trust them. Croatia does follow, at least the courts of Croatia do follow the Article 3 of its constitution and all the other articles apparently as well, freedom of movement, and so on. And so we are going to settle the matter before the courts, and that's both for the rescues, so that if that gets settled, then they have no way to get rid of the settlers, and also for the parking signs, so that if it gets settled, our boats, at the very least, will not be stopped or hindered. And if it doesn't get settled, we will appeal. So this is what we're doing. It is underway. It costs money. So if you could help us do this, this is one of the main avenues of helping our settlers to not get harassed. So one thing is to help the settlers to be there, but then comes the Croatian police and you have to do something. But imagine that the Croatian police would not come. Or they would come when we call them, when we need their help, because that's what the police should be, at least theoretically, doing. They should be helping you. Often they aren't, like traffic police in my own country, but that's a different story. That's not the system. That's a bug. That's not a feature. So all we're trying is to restore the rule of law, is to restore the situation as should be according to the law of Croatia, of Serbia, and international law, because Liberland is legal, Liberland is legitimate, family-friendly, and it is beneficial. And last but not least, I said in the beginning that the Badinter uncertainty wasn't good for the territory. Well, we want to change that. We're here to change that. We want to create a little Monaco, or big Monaco, actually bigger than 3 Monacos, in that middle of not a very prosperous part of Croatia. And it would bring jobs, opportunities, and put that part of Croatia on the map like nothing else can. So even from the material point of view, we're bringing good things to the territory.